Okay, here's the thing about this gen for me. The greatest pure advantage of the Xbox Series X, and to a lesser extent the Xbox Series S, is the performance of games compared to last gen. The frame rate is the best thing about the Xbox Series X this generation. Better than ray tracing, better than faster load times, better than increased texture details, and better than having 4K resolutions, which we already had with the mid-gen refresh of the Xbox One X. Sure, you can stop the game, get out your magnifying glass and check out the increased details, but when it comes to just sitting back and taking in what makes this gen so incredible, you can see the difference in frame rates right away, and the faster the gameplay and better reflexes you need, it becomes even more apparent. But this video is going to compare the Series X to last gen's One X, but also to itself when it comes to quality versus performance modes, as not all games had an Xbox One X enhancement. Plus, I'm not including any Xbox 360 games, but please, if you like the video, then give it a thumbs up, subscribe, share and leave a comment, as it helps get the video recommended to others. Check out the Discord, but now let's get to it. So at number 20, it's The Division 2, and this seems like another game which has been forgotten, but when compared to the latest Tom Clancy games such as Breakpoint, The Division 2 looks like a masterpiece. And it was great when it released, and it's really worth playing if you haven't in a long time, or if you never have. The jump up to 60 frames is of course excellent, and playing this back on the Xbox One X at 30 frames, I didn't really have any issues with it, as it was definitely smooth most of the time, but now that we get it at 4K, plus the frames, it's just so silky smooth. The gunplay and movement between cover, throwing out gadgets and swapping weapons just feels so much better. Excellent game overall too. Next at 19, it's Sea of Thieves, and what's better than watching this gorgeous world complete with its incredible looking ocean and its behaviour and the dazzling orange glow of the sunsets? Well, look at it all in 4K and running at a constant 60 frames per second. This was already a good looking game, complete with its own visual aesthetic, but it just runs so damn smoothly now compared to last gen. The improved load times also make this the version to play if you're able to. And if you're a console gamer, there just isn't any compromises when it comes to Sea of Thieves on the Xbox Series X. Like, it's how the game was meant to be run. But the Xbox Series S also gives a very good experience at 60 frames, just at 1080p. Then at 18 we have Dying Light 2, and this is a comparison based upon the game's own 30 versus 60 frames per second modes, both running on the Xbox Series X as well. They're quite frankly pretty damn different to each other, with both modes having good points and some not so good points. So with the 30 frames per second graphics mode, we get ray tracing with a higher res, better looking shadows and more detail when it comes to things like grass, but there is a huge hit to the frame rate, as like I said, it's 30 frames per second. And with the first person view and how you parkour around the place, the jerky view as you climb up for example, the 60 frames mode, whilst getting rid of ray tracing and more detail, this is the way to play it. But this has received an update for 1440p now as well. Everything is much smoother, and you'll find that playing in this mode is sure as shit a much better way to play the game. For 17, it's Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and there have been several Assassin's Creed games, both newer and back compat, which have received the 60 frames treatment. But as AC Odyssey, apart from being my favourite of the newer games, it just looks so good to see the world being thrown around at 60, especially with the fantastic Greek architecture around. When playing on the Series X, it inherits the One X enhancements like 4K resolution and HDR, but also great crowd density and more detailed textures in the world. But as I mentioned right at the beginning, the increase in performance wins the day, and there's never been a better time to play this on the console. Next at 16 we have Destiny 2, and this one is entering its 5th year and has had more changes, more things ripped in and out of it, then re-added than probably any game out there. Plus it's just had the Witch Queen update, but playing this on the Series X compared to last gen is just, holy shit, it's just so much better. This already had an Xbox One X update, which brought with it 4K with HDR, but with the Xbox Series X, the game gets stepped up to 60 frames during the PvE content and 120 in the competitive multiplayer. But it also receives the fantastic field of view slider that more and more games are getting these days on consoles, pulling back the in-game perspective so you can see more around you. When compared to how I used to play this game without it, I just couldn't go back. Plus D2 looks fantastic. Then at 15 I'm going with Forza Horizon 5, and for this reason. I'm taking an absolutely stunning game already and pitting each mode against each other. The 30 frames per second mode with the greater visual details, aiming for a higher resolution, and the 60 frames mode, which drops the detail but has the higher frames. And the winner, the frames per second of course. Yeah, when the cars have stopped and you look closer at the picture, or for some reason you have them running side by side, the game does look slightly better. But man, when the cars get racing and it's all at 60 frames per second as the world just flies by and still looks spectacular. The game is amazingly smooth even at 30, and it's most definitely playable, but damn, the jump to 60 with a world this beautiful, it's just so next gen. And at 14, it's Warhammer Vermintide 2, a game I really like, and if you can play this one co-op with some friends or family, then I suggest that you do. And this one received the 1x enhancement, which saw the resolution increase to reach 4K, well beyond what the base Xbox One consoles could do. But in terms of performance, it was stuck at 30, which really makes the gunplay and especially hacking and slashing away with a sword feel really sluggish. Like you're lifting this sword through a pool of water, but the move over to the Xbox Series X and being able to play at 60 frames per second, and the whole game is just transformed. It maintains a higher resolution, and the 60 frames makes everything feel much more responsive. Such a good game. Next at 13, it's Guardians of the Galaxy, and this comparison is on the Series X modes. And I wouldn't suggest playing this on the base Xbox One, with the 1X offering a 30 frames per second and dynamic 4K, which is quite good. But on Series X, running with ray tracing and at 30, the game looks gorgeous and it manages to keep that 30 most of the time too. So it's good, but getting rid of that ray tracing and doubling the performance to 60 just makes everything feel so much smoother for myself, especially when there's several enemies on screen at once and the environmental effects are more intense. That smoother performance makes for much more enjoyable gameplay, which really isn't the game's strongest point to begin with. Then for number 12, it's Jedi Fallen Order, and even though I really enjoyed this game, I did find it a bit messy at times, but it's also an example of the performance of last gen systems really getting in the way of a completely enjoyable game, with even the 1X not being able to reach a stable 60 frames per second the majority of the time, which is pretty jarring. But it did have HDR, but now on Series X, it has a graphics and performance mode, with the former aiming for true 4K, but it fluctuates, whilst performance hits that 60 frames way more than before, but the resolution is lowered with a range of 1080p to 1440. Not ideal, but playing the game is much more enjoyable this way. Number 11, it's Skyrim, and even though it's been around for what seems like forever, the Series X and S optimized versions really just improve the graphics and feel of the game so much that new life is breathed into it. The increased 4K resolution, plus the addition of mods and graphical mod support as well, really make the game look, well, really quite good at times. Plus we get the 60 frames, which makes the melee feel much better, even if it is still slightly rough and not perfect. Loading times are greatly improved as well, especially if you're wanting to fast travel a lot. If you've never played it, you should. If you have, it's still worth going back to. It's also pretty good via the cloud as well. At number 10, it's Cyberpunk 2077, and this is a comparison between the ray tracing and performance modes of the Series X. We all know what a giant hunk of shit this was performance-wise on the base Xbox One, but the 1X was okay for a 30 frames per second game, but it did dip regularly. The ray tracing mode on Series X is also at 30, and it has a higher dynamic res, but it never feels very smooth, especially when driving around at speed. So the 60 frames per second mode is the way to go, even if it's locked at 1440p. But even at 60 frames, it still isn't perfect, which is a shame, but it's such a giant leap over last gen that it makes the list. For number 9, it's Watch Dogs Legion, which takes an already beautiful game, even back on the 1X, which had a very consistent frame rate at 30, but on the Series X, you get the choice of ray tracing at 30 or a non-ray tracing mode at 60. And this is an example where I hope devs can start implementing a 60 frames per second ray tracing mode at lower resolutions, or a non-ray tracing mode at 60 frames per second. And this is an example where I hope devs can start implementing a 60 frames per second ray tracing mode at lower resolutions. In terms of the whole game, even without the RT, the detail around the city is impressive, and having it fly past at 60 frames shows the difference between last gen and this one. It doesn't make up for the shortcomings of the game, but it's a welcome improvement. Coming in at number 8, we have Chivalry 2, which gets 3 modes on Series X. A 30 frames ray trace mode, a 60 frames per second mode, which disables the feature, and another uncapped frame rate mode on the Series X. The game has a good level of detail at 4K, but when it comes to these large scale battles and really anything to do with multiplayer, I find you just can't go past playing at 60, as when you see all of the players roaming around, but even more so, once again, Everything just feels more responsive when swinging your sword, and I didn't notice any significant or even minor dips in the frame rate. On the One X, the game looks great, but the frame rate stutters and it's just so damn choppy. Series X is the way it's meant to be played. Up at 7 we have Crash Bandicoot 4, and when it comes to modern day platformers, even ones that look this good, when we're jumping between platforms, we need responsive controls and higher frames, and those two things make the game much more enjoyable to play. So this one is easy to say what it has. It's 4K 60 on the Series X, with Series S getting the 60 frames treatment, just at an upscaled 4K. When compared to the One X, that ran at 1080p and 60 frames, whilst the base Xbox One dropped the resolution further to manage a 60 frames per second rate, but it really had regular drops. When it comes to the visuals, you can really tell the difference between the One X at 1080 and the Series X at 4K. For number 6, it's The Elder Scrolls Online, and if you watched another recent video of mine, you'd know just how much I think this game is just excellent and continues to get better. On the One X, this ran at 4K HDR, and it already looked very good. If you remember that it's an MMO, but now the Series X version retains that crisp 4K HDR visuals, but now it all runs at a smooth 60 frames per second. It's had an increase in texture detail, including when looking at them at distance, plus increased draw distances as well. All of those put together make playing this on the Series X the best way to play on console, but also because of the much quicker load times. At number 5, it's Borderlands 3, the game with fantastic gunplay, great visuals, smooth gameplay, and a shit story and villains. Well, in the base game at least, and this one struggled with its performance on last gen systems. This just had HDR on the One X enhancement, plus a resolution and performance mode, but it could barely hit 60 at any meaningful point with constant stutters and frame drops. Resolution mode was better, but at 30 frames per second. Series X hits the 4K 60 much more often, and it's just such a better experience because of it, plus some additional shadow quality as well. It has much more fluid gameplay, especially if you opt for the 120 frames per second mode. Next at 4, it's Control, but it's struggling on the Xbox One X and regularly dropping below 30 on the base Xbox One. But with the Ultimate Edition and the move to next gen, the game has become so much better. The ray tracing here is very impressive, especially when it comes to the reflections, and it's a 1440p native resolution with no scaling, but with the frame rate capped at 30, it just never feels smooth, and it's not what you need when the action heats up. With the Ultimate Edition at 60, that's how the game is meant to be played, but there are still some frame drops, but it's just overall a much better way to play it. Then for number 3, it's Ghostrunner, and this game is quite the looker with ray tracing and performance modes running at 4K. It's like a Cyberpunk styled Hong Kong, and this makes it so far up the list because this isn't even perfect on the Series X, but even with its imperfections it was greatly needed, as this wasn't One X enhanced, and well, although it looks good, the frame rate fluctuates more than cryptocurrency. It just never feels smooth, which is really needed here. Series X gets the RT mode, but that still isn't smooth enough for what the game needs. This one is all about performance completely for myself, as the extra frames and precision is needed so much. It's a great difficult game. For number 2, we have Metro Exodus, which is hard to believe it ran as good as it did on last gen on the One X, but now it's just so much better on the Series X, and it shows off the real difference between the generations. It has a dynamic res, so it's not 4K, but Metro Exodus is almost one of a kind, where it has large, open spaces, but now runs with ray tracing and at 60 frames per second with great shadow and texture detail, coming much closer to a good PC experience when compared to One X. Series S even gets the ray traced 60 frames per second treatment, but the resolution can drop quite low to achieve it. With Metro Exodus, the Series X completely pulls ahead even over the last gen console refresh of the One X. And at the top spot, it's No Man's Sky, and that's because the game has transformed not just in content and things to do, but the jump to next gen is just fantastic. Series X now runs it at 4K 60, with the Series S getting 30 and 60 frames per second modes, but the increase in planetary detail dwarfs what was seen before as well. More advanced lighting, shadows, animation fidelity, greater draw distances, and better quality textures. Creating structures can be larger and more intricate. Multiplayer gets bumped up to 32 players, and load times are a lot faster than what was possible last gen as well. A one-of-a-kind game that benefits greatly from the more powerful hardware. So there are 20 of the best graphics on Xbox Series X and S, where the difference between 30 and 60 is really noticeable. It just makes playing the game so much better, where the hardware easily outperforms what came before. But which games have impressed you the most when making the jump to next gen? Please let me know down in the comments, as it really helps get the video pushed out to others and get it recommended. Give it a share and a thumbs up, subscribe and stop by the Discord, and with that, I'll see you on the next video.